Hello, wherever you're logging on from, welcome to this one of the final sessions in what has been a beautiful, a very informative, a very effective 3 days of engagement in this Frontiers of Research in Caribbean Science and Technology Forecast Conference for 2022. Now, we have had some successful presentations so far, and this particular session that we're having now is a discussion, a high-level panel discussion about post-COVID-19 challenges facing Caricom scientific solutions. Now, the panel that we have to discuss this very important issue is an esteemed one, and it is my pleasure to welcome them particularly and introduce them as we jump right in to getting the conversation underway. And I would like to start with Dr. the Right Honourable Keith Mitchell, former Prime Minister of Grenada, former lead head of government in the Caricom Quasi cabinet with responsibility for science and technology, including ICT, former Prime Minister of Grenada, the Right Honourable, Dr. the Right Honourable Keith Mitchell, was born in St. George, Grenada, received his primary education at the Happy Hill RC School and the J.W. Fletcher Memorial School, went on to Presentation Brothers College, then the University of the West Indies Cave Hill campus, gained his Bachelor of Science degree in Mathematics and Chemistry, followed by a master's degree from Howard University and a doctorate in Mathematics and Statistics from American University as well. He was a mathematics professor at Howard University, started his own consulting firm in Washington, D.C., provided consultancy services to many government departments and private corporations in the United States as well. And we were so lucky and honored to have him as our main presenter on day one. And I'm told that that presentation was quite impactful. Looking forward to hearing the links from that to our conversation today. The second panelist with us is representing the government of Jamaica, Member of Parliament, and of course, our Minister, Floyd O'Brien Green, attorney at law, Member of Parliament, served as Jamaica's youngest Minister of Agriculture, son of St. Elizabeth, now serving his second term as Member of Parliament for St. Elizabeth Southwestern, which we call Jamaica's breadbasket, molded by Monroe College, further polished by the University of the West Indies, where he read for a degree in history, minor in political science, and then awarded his Bachelor of Laws degree with honors from UWI Cave Hill in Barbados and legal education certificate from the Norman Manley Law School. He has served the Jamaican government, first as Minister of State in the Ministry of Education, Youth and Information, then as Minister of State in the Ministry of Industry, Commerce, Agriculture and Fisheries. And in those years of service was credited with tabling Jamaica's national youth policy, forming Jamaica's Youth Advisory Council, reforming Jamaica's Child Protection Agency, assessing the impact of Jamaica's creative industry, and lobbying and bringing to fruition Jamaica's first group life and health insurance for farmers and fisherfolk. As Minister of Agriculture, he crafted Jamaica's new face of food strategy and has now moved to serving the people of Jamaica as Minister without portfolio in the office of the Prime Minister. With us also is Principal Professor Dale Webber. He was appointed to the position of Pro-Vice-Chancellor and Principal of the Mona campus at the UWI, and he has had a distinguished career in coastal ecology and environmental management, strong, consistent record of teaching, graduate supervision, administrative and research excellence, which spans 30 years of service with the university, teaching and leadership roles in the Department of Life Sciences, at the Center for Marine Sciences at Mona. He's held the Grace Kennedy James Masolomon Senior Chair in Environmental Management, Director for the Center of Environmental Management, and also with an excellent record of public service, Chairman of the Environmental Foundation of Jamaica, Convener of Cape Environmental Sciences Panel for the Caribbean Examinations Council, Chairman of CL Environmental Company, Chairman of Jamaica's Climate Change Advisory Board, among other accolades. Also with us, Professor Colin Gyles. And Professor Gyles comes to us from our other partner in this conference, the University of Technology. He has had a successful career as a lecturer, multidisciplinary scientist, and academic administrator. He is currently acting president of the University of Technology. He holds a PhD in chemistry with a multidisciplinary focus from UWI. He served the University of Technology in academic and leadership roles. Lecturer, professor, associate professor. He is published in leading international peer-reviewed and scientific journals, and he was instrumental in the development and implementation of the Faculty of Science and Sport in 2009 and served as the faculty's first dean. He also gives service on a number of boards and committees at the national and community levels, including the National Commission on Science and Technology, the Industry Advisory Council for the Ministry of Industry, Investment and Commerce, the National Planning Task Force for Science, Technology and Innovation for the PIOJ, and the Advisory Board of the Michael University College Graduate School of Education. Our next panelist is Rosemary Valentine. Professor Rosemary Valentine is the Pro-Vice-Chancellor, Campus Principal, Chaired Professor Labor of Law and Offshore Financial Law for the UWI St. Augustine Campus. She's an attorney, an award-winning scholar and author, international consultant, and Court of Appeal judge and activist. She was elected president of the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, OAS in Washington. She was the rapporteur for Indigenous Peoples, head of the Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights Unit for the OAS, Caricom chair on HIV, migration, chair of the Caricom Regional Commission on Marijuana, president of the Family Planning Association, Cambridge Fellow, member of Trinidad and Tobago's Industrial Relations Advisory Committee, and honorary fellow of the International Society for Trust Practitioners, and the only Caribbean person and trustee of the London IPPF board. She's published 15 books, numerous scholarly articles, and served as consultant to all the governments in the Caribbean, as well as in the UK, Venezuela, USA, Canada, and other international organizations and NGOs. Professor Clive Landis rounds off our esteemed panel, and he is professor of cardiovascular research. He assumed the role of Pro-Vice-Chancellor and Principal of the University of the West Indies Cave Hill campus on August 1, last year, 2021, previously served as Deputy Principal of the Cave Hill campus and Pro-Vice-Chancellor, Board for Undergraduate Studies. He's an experienced researcher. He's published over 150 scientific papers and conference presentations on the pathophysiology of inflammation during wound healing, vascular disease, and recovery post-surgery. More recent interests have centered on viral and public health research, established viruses such as HIV, and emerging viruses such as ZIKV and SARS-CoV-2. Professor Landis's interest in HIV has revolved around the immunology PhD program that he founded at Cave Hill, as well as a 16-year research collaboration with the Public HIV Laboratory. On the regional level, he served as the chair of the UWI Zika Task Force, the COVID-19 Task Force, while supporting laboratory capacity building as chair of the Caribbean Cytometry and Analytical Society. His most recent research has focused on policy response during a time of pandemic. Now, with that wide array of interests and expertise, we understand that the right panel is here, because for this panel discussion, we are interested on how the views of our various panelists on the Caribbean scientific community, in conjunction with information and perspectives from government and private sector organizations, may chart the way forward in the region, giving the many challenges that COVID-19, climate change, and the war in Ukraine have created. So we say it's post-COVID-19 challenges, but it really is a time of challenges from various angles and directions. And so with all that said, we now get into the conversation, and I would like to ask our panelists for their opening comments before we move into our first question. So we will start with Dr. Mitchell.
Thank you, my dear sister. Just to say that I value this opportunity to be part of this very important discussion here today. I think this is something I believe that should be done and clearly a more regular basis because of the number of critical issues that the region have been facing and will continue to face, whether it's in the area of health issues, whether it's in the area of disaster, and other critical areas. So the need for that constant feedback or information or interaction between the scientific community and the stakeholders in the region as a whole, I think it's something that I certainly believe we need to have a lot more of these type of discussions. So I value to bring a perspective from my years of experience, of which is 38 years been part of the government activities in the region as a whole. I value being here and offering my view as I see it with respect to the topic today. As you know, COVID-19 has affected all of our lives in so many different ways. The impact it had on my own country, and I saw the impact of other colleagues throughout the entire region. So knowing that a lot of the solutions for many of the issues we talk about lay in the initiative of the scientific community, I really feel that we need to do much more of this. I want to just make one more point before I end my first statement here. I genuinely believe that we need to have the private sector much more involved in what we are talking about, because let's face it, governments are in fact stretched in every respect. I know a lot of times when we are called upon by the university and by other institution to find more resources, sometimes it becomes very taxing for us. And since many of the solutions and many of the issues involve the private sector, the beneficiary, or the ones that would lose if solutions are not found the most, it seems to me that they have an important role to play. And I don't believe, based on what my experiences, that the private sector themselves understand enough of the importance of being an essential part of discussions on issues of this nature at the national and regional level. So I just wanted to add that point. There are other institutions that must be involved, but I believe the private sector need to be a lot more involved than they have been historically so.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mitchell. We'll now move to Professor Gyles. Your opening comments, please.
Okay, thank you so much, Madam Moderator, and I'd like to acknowledge the other members of the panel, Dr. the Honourable Keith Mitchell, Honourable Floyd Green, fellow principals from the different campuses of the University of the West Indies. It is indeed, and ladies and gentlemen of the audience who are joining us on the various platforms, and those who have been participating during this notable conference, the first of its kind in the region, especially at a critical time like this. I just want to extend a pleasant good afternoon to you all. I'm delighted to be a part of the discussion today on such a very important topic as post-COVID-19 challenges facing Caricom. According to an April 2022 World Bank statement, the aftermath of the COVID-19 crisis will take years to fade if Latin America and Caribbean countries do not take immediate action to kickstart a slow recovery process with poverty at its highest levels in decades. Long-standing challenges in infrastructure, education, innovation, and spending efficiency must be met with policy reforms that also address the effects of climate change and take advantage of the enormous opportunities for growth on the path to more sustainable economies. I note this statement because while it highlights the list of long-standing challenges in our region, which have been exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic, the statement also underscores the point that our response must tackle sustainable solutions to these profound challenges in the areas of poverty, infrastructure, issues in education, innovation, and climate change. It has been said that in every crisis, there's an opportunity. Over the last 2 days of this forecast conference, we have been exposed to the myriad opportunities presented by science and technology as one important response and strategy to rebuilding from the crisis. Of course, it is now well established that knowledge and application of science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, STEM, must be harnessed in response to these protracted challenges. From our vantage point, as the two leading tertiary education providers in the Caribbean region, I believe that our own contribution to the response must be through the redoubling of our efforts to strengthen access and interest in STEM education. Our two universities must combine our strengths in accelerating STEM capacity building to meet the pressing new demands of a knowledge-driven era. As higher education leaders, we are now challenged to remain ever mindful that we are operating in the context of a fourth industrial revolution, characterized by revolutionary advances in ICT and new and emerging engineering technologies, and by the virtual blurring of boundaries between the physical and digital worlds. In this context, it is critical that we examine the sectors that are growing globally and those that are emerging as part of the ICT revolution, with a view to constantly revising our academic program offerings. And so, while our universities have often been criticized as being ivory towers, our leading tertiary institutions in the region must make clearer to the public the relationship between teaching and research and its impact on sustainable development in the society. Higher education institutions such as the UWI and UTech Jamaica must be at the forefront of designing and redesigning courses of study that will help to fuel the transfer of knowledge of science and technology to other sectors of life, including but not limited to growing areas such as agriculture and food security. And we see that coming up more as a global issue, even with the recent war in Ukraine. We have to look at areas such as hospitality and tourism, technical and vocational education, and of course, in the science and technology of sport. Aligned to the global economic realities, it is imperative that we push our respective governments to establish clear policy direction supported by more substantial commitment of funding and other needed resources for our universities. As this audience is aware, adequate funding support to drive the urgent task of first-class education and training for the development of the workforce in the region continues to be a major challenge. And with those thoughts, I will close my opening comments, and I will thank you all for listening as we hope to share further. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Gyles. We look forward to hearing more about those issues that you have mentioned. And at this time, I now invite the Principal, Pro-Vice-Chancellor and Principal of the UWI Mona campus, Professor Dale Webber. Your opening remarks, sir.
Good afternoon to you, Paula-Ann, and colleagues. It is so good to be here because, one, I see friends of science and technology all seated and all making statements on something that I think we've all agreed on. Science and technology is a clear driver of development and transformation, and the UWI and UTech together are two of the entities who partner with the government and public and private sector to make a difference. As I think about a post-COVID challenge that would face Caricom and how science and technology can make a difference, scientific solutions become very clear. The three things that I put on the table very quickly are food security and agriculture. We should be using science and technology to determine what we grow, where we grow, how we grow. But not only how we start, but then how do we keep it going? How do we distribute? And what do we do in terms of post-harvest physiology? How do we make it better for longer? Science clearly is a bridge that opens many doors. And I think we have the opportunity to do just that. COVID is an opportunity. Put aside all that it has done. Secondly, environmental and natural resource management is a key part of what we do post-COVID. Not just water resources, but all environmental resources. We think about how many persons live close to the coast. We think about the blue economy. We think about coastal zone management and green engineering. We must be using science and technology to make a difference in our environment, our natural resources, as we intend to preserve them for the next generation, or as we intend to use them as we move forward. And thirdly, science and technology is a key part of that solution in terms of decision making, modeling, forecasting, no pun intended on the name of the conference, but being able to use artificial intelligence to decide what are the best ways to do what we have to do. We had a perfect example here at the UWI Mona campus where the Mona J Informatics unit used data, geospatial data, to determine which schools should open when, based on vulnerabilities, based on availability of running water, based on what we had in terms of vaccination in various locations. We're able to help the ministry and the government through their guided approach to determine what we should do in each of those communities. Data provides answers and opportunities for us to grow. I'm extremely excited that all three campuses here of the UWI and the UTech have decided to put their thoughts together. And I'd like to commend those who have put the thoughts together for us to continue working together. I look forward to future synergies and associations as we get better at doing what we do best. Thank you very much, and I look forward to the continued discussions.
Thank you, Professor. And now we move from one professor to another. From Professor Dale Weber, we now ask Professor Rosemary Valentine from the St. Augustine campus for her opening remarks. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Well, of course, I'm not a scientist. I'm a lawyer and a legal scholar, although I was a science student. But it strikes me that law is vital for giving effect to scientific solutions and also identifying some of the challenges that are to be resolved by science. So there is a confluence, and that was certainly demonstrated in the COVID pandemic. We should be working hand to hand. Law I've always seen as a social engineer, an instrument of change. And what we saw in the COVID pandemic, it uniquely confronted the legal infrastructure. It is forcing us to reimagine law and policy in many arenas. And I think actually reevaluate the very raison d'etre of law. And I suspect science as well, very fascinating jurisprudential phase. And we saw, and we still see how law followed the science and science followed the law, and sometimes imperfectly. But what that reinforces for me is that there does need to be a multidisciplinary approach to everything we do. And as a principal, a new principal, having to refine a research agenda, that is certainly something I'm committed to. I was one of those clueless people wanting to put my voice in terms of writing about vaccines and legal regulations and COVID, etc. Of course, all free, giving advice to public, governments, etc. And I was able to predict the outcomes of what transpired in the courts after. And the reason I was able to do that is because, apart from understanding constitutions and labor law and so, was because I had a good appreciation of the science behind the COVID. And it's interesting to hear Principal Weber talk about how we use the science for some of those opening of a school and so on. Because listening and reading, educating myself, and speaking to colleagues like my Dean of Medicine here, Simangal, I understood that the bottom line is that the courts will instinctively reach to whatever the scientific basis is, the grounding. It will go by way of the traditional scientific knowledge. So can we have a mandatory vaccine, quarantines, regulations, states of emergencies, and so on? We don't know if the vaccines will help. People were saying, you know, what's the point? There was a lot of misinformation and hype. There still is, but the court said, no, we're going with the established science, which is exactly what we saw in the HIV pandemic. And I was also involved in that from the very beginning in the legal bits, and it was the same thing. And having worked with doctors and scientists for HIV, I saw the parallels, some of the same challenges and solutions in HIV, you know, in employment law. And so people didn't want to work with others, the stigma, the negative impact, which had an effect on treatment, on testing, on public health. Dr. Mitchell, you remember that whole episode. And finally, the courts had to make real life practical decisions in the face of the paranoia.
Yes.
No, you can't fire someone who's HIV positive or is perceived to be. That landmark case of Hoffman and South African Airways. And so on. So the medical science is what the courts instinctively reach to. But we know that pragmatic approach, as I've always called it, and balancing risk. And this is both a scientific and a legal proposition. So everyone today is an expert in human rights after COVID, individual rights, but we have forgotten. And I spent 25 years trying to persuade people that human rights was actually relevant to us. But now all of a sudden I said it's a buzzword. But we probably didn't understand the nuances and didn't reflect enough soberly on human rights and laws, because they are not based only on individualistic notions of freedom. If you go right back to the basic, there's a social contract, and it's about balancing risk, about harm to others, what we call the public interest, which also the science, in particular the medical science, looks at. So just as medical and scientific ethics must consider the public good and public interest, so does law and human rights. And that's the basis. That's what the courts began to talk about. The Bridges case, the first case on COVID in the United States, and that age-old case, Jacobson, that years ago gave us the rationale to be able to mandate vaccines for babies that we do now 100 years ago. But I think, though, although we know that we have to use the scientific rationale and the risks and balance and so on, there needs to be a fuller understanding of both the law and the science to feed on each other if we are to arrive at useful and just solutions. And I think there's a failing here that we need to move forward with, because we left behind a lot of the public. In fact, I recall in one webinar, I'm going to stop here, in one webinar, one of my colleagues was arguing against vaccines and quarantines, and his rationale was because, well, you could still get COVID if you're vaccinated. And of course, that was not the basis of a vaccine. He was based on a flawed premise. He did backtrack at the end, retract. But I think we need to demystify science, just as we need to demystify law. And we saw it in this pandemic, that the right answer in law and in science was out of step with the public's understanding. So there's a poor understanding of the science, and that fuels fear and suspicion. And so science has a responsibility to demystify itself and outreach if it is to have real solutions. So I'll stop there for the time being.
Thank you so much, Professor Antoine. And it is those gaps that you are identifying that we're hoping this panel discussion can help to find solutions for and to fill. We also have Professor Clive Landis, Pro-Vice-Chancellor and Principal for the UWI Cave Hill. Professor Landis, your remarks?
Well, thank you very much. I suspect I've been invited onto this panel because I chaired the UWI's COVID-19 task force, as I did for the Zika pandemic in 2016. And I'm going to start by saying that I felt really honored, and I felt proud of the solidarity which I saw in the Caribbean, which was quite different from what we saw in other countries. And, you know, I think we need to recognize where we did right. So I think the political leadership was very sound. We didn't have politicization of the pandemic as we saw in other countries. We had excellent collaboration across Caricom and all of its agencies, including the UWI. And so it was a great pleasure to really reconnect with my colleagues in the Caribbean Public Health Agency, in the Caribbean Disaster and Emergency Management Agency, the Regional Security Service, the Committee on Health and Social Development. These are really wonderful agencies of Caricom that came together and really delivered. And I ran an analysis just a few days ago, which is an update on one which I've published a couple of times. And we're still significantly better as a region in terms of deaths from COVID-19 per standard population size. So you can compare a small country with a big country, or even an entire region. And we're still comfortably at half the deaths per million persons if you compare us with the US, for example, or with Latin America. So you know, let's give ourselves credit that we handled the pandemic with respect to the preparedness for the testing, which was excellent, and basically the treatments, which I think maybe we surprised ourselves at how well we handled it. But where, of course, I sometimes call it a bipolar pandemic. We had a good pandemic in terms of viral control, but no, we did not have a good pandemic in respect to the secondary issues that arose from it. And of course, the impact on schools and education really worries me, that children have been heavily affected and might have lasting, maybe even lifelong impacts on their learning and their career progression. And of course, I'm very worried about the socioeconomic impacts, with a lot of people losing their jobs, with the government struggling in all regards to make payments, including, for example, to UWI. I think UWI is a very worthy entity, and we appreciate that the governments struggle to support us, and the impacts also on mental health, anxiety, things like that. So in the future, when we do these models, which even we have done at UWI, modeling, about the impact of what would happen if we did a lockdown or we didn't do a lockdown, in terms of, the pressure on our hospitals, on bed capacity, critical care capacity, things like that. In the future, I only ever want to see a model like that accompanied with a model which would also say, all right, you will save X number of lives, but you will also have this impact on how many children will have their schooling interrupted, how many people will lose their job, and what would be the impact on mental health. So I think we have to take a more holistic picture in the future if ever we encounter such a situation again.
Very good points. Thank you, Professor Landis. And now, ladies and gentlemen, our Minister Floyd Green, your opening remarks, sir.
Thank you very much, Paula, and let me say a special good afternoon to all the panelists. It is my honor. I think this is a wonderful conference, and I'm very happy to share, and you will allow me to single out former Prime Minister Keith Mitchell. It's always a pleasure, sir. And good to see you. Hopefully I see you in Jamaica soon. I think there is no question that if the Caribbean is to grow, sustain, and if we are to do well, especially in relation to our current global realities, then there must be increased focus on science and technology research. Science and technology is critical now for us to move the region forward and to create the Caribbean that we have spoken about for decades, but we have really been unable to capture. And I think we have gone through a wide breadth of commentary already in relation to the various opening remarks, and a lot of them have been on point regarding COVID-19 and the intersection with science and technology and law. So I want to frame probably my opening remarks around some of those same points, but in a different vein. How will we truly ensure that the Caribbean as a region becomes creators of technology and not just users of technology? And I think that has to be part of our mission and part of our drive as we contemplate science and technology in the 21st century. Again, we have unfortunately gotten into a sort of mode where we are much more focused on use. But unless we have institutional-led research that is backed, supported, or driven by the private sector, statement that former Prime Minister Mitchell already highlighted, then we will continue to just be users of the technology and not creators of the technology. Where we sit in government and here in the government of Jamaica, what we really want to see is the region transforming to be those creators, and Jamaica being the hub and being the Silicon Valley of this region. Again, when I looked at the topic and we looked at COVID-19 and some of the challenges post-COVID-19 and the solutions that are needed, scientific solutions that are needed. You know, one of the interesting realities is that COVID-19, while it did come with its own set of challenges for the region, I found that it really just made the challenges we had before so much worse. So a lot of the challenges are not new. We have been having conversations about how much we trade with each other. We've been having conversations about our food security long before COVID-19. And we have been in various institutions researching on ways to make our region more food secure. But I do find that our research stays within the halls of the institution. So the question will be, how can government, private sector, and academia work together to take those solutions, some that are done at the level of our professors, at the level of our students, and ensure that they are implemented on the scale that can create impact. And I believe agriculture is one of those areas in which we should not only be doing more in relation to research, but applied research, practical research that is creating more productive and efficient systems out in our fields. Again, I feel like we used to do a lot of that. I feel like there was a time that we all used to sing the praises of Bodles, and we were researching, doing strong genetic research to ensure that we develop fit for purpose cattle and herds and things of that nature. But we have moved away from that. I believe that our research agenda has gotten very, very, I'm trying to find a good word and not to say cowardice, but our research agenda is not bold enough for us to really take advantage of the opportunities. The last thing I will say is that I believe COVID-19 presented us with a tremendous opportunity because it highlighted the grave deficiency we have in the digital transformation journey, the significant disparity across our various islands, in our islands, across various socioeconomic groupings regarding access to technology and how we have used or not used technology to transform the delivery of government services. I believe that is a clear opportunity now for us, especially based on our size, based on our history, to really digitally transform the Caribbean and to move from our old bureaucratic British-bound systems to efficient technology-based systems. Again, our institutions, however, are really a good place to lead that charge. So a lot of introspection will have to be done to see if we are making that transitional step. Those are my opening remarks, and I look forward to the conversation that we will have.
Thank you so much, Minister Green. Ladies and gentlemen, all. So there are so many different points and issues that have been raised. I've been looking at some of the common ones, and we had Dr. Mitchell talking about the need for collaboration and the private sector needs to be more involved. We looked at Professor Gyles, also looking at the intersection of teaching and research, contributing to development, which takes it out of academia. And we've also heard the conversation talking about needing a better understanding of law and science so that the public can understand what's going on as decisions are made. And all of that is in one way, shape, or form impacted by financing. Do you believe that we are doing the right things when it comes on to financing? Is there a place for perhaps a national or regional fund for pure research or for incubators? Or is there a place for the private sector in terms of funding the research? How can financing be approached in a way that it has a regional perspective and can benefit in that way? I'd like to start with you, Dr. Mitchell. Your thoughts?
Yeah, I really wanted to speak to that. Sister Antoine, opening statement made a point, which is really, to me, very deep. And she was speaking about the buy-in from people, the population. Now, whatever we do, now how much significance the result of our research is, or whatever we're doing at the academic level, scientific level, buying from the people is so vital. If we are talking about raising funds, the politician has to be accountable. If he talks about just putting money in a particular fund for scientific research, and the people's understanding of science is them bright boys in university, that's not for me. It isn't going anywhere. The politician would be some measure of control will be there on his initiatives. I give you an example, colleagues. With COVID-19, before COVID-19, we in Grenada invested enormous amount of the monies into PCs and providing computer knowledge and so on to students and teachers. So COVID-19 came, so we had to use the ICT platforms to do some teaching because, as you know, students are out of classroom for months, or in some cases almost a year. Mm-hmm. No, so what has happened there is the students were coming from the more well-to-do environment in the society, where parents are much more, there's more family-oriented structure. These students coming from these homes were able to utilize, in a general sense, not everybody, but generally. What happened was, the kids coming, we found out, the kids coming from the rural community. In many cases, it's not like when I was growing up, it was the two-family concept. It's a single mother, or in some cases, single father. Most of them having difficulty with all the kids available that they have to deal with. They are so glad when kids are out of home, there are less problem. What is happening, and when these kids were home, they have a PC, but they were not using it. And because of the lack of control there and the family structure, these kids were being left behind. We found out later, a lot of them hardly used the system when they were out of school. And we know, and I know, had it not been for serious education, I would not be sitting here talking to you guys now. So we know that the road towards getting away from poverty. Now, if you have a system where it's increasing the distance between the haves and the haves not, as we did in that case, you have a serious problem on your hand, serious social problems. So it seems to me, the question is, we have to address, how do we ensure that that in the process of initiating any serious initiative to bring information or to bring education or whatever to the community, how do we ensure that the mass of people are involved and they are buying in what we are trying to do? Because that is going to be crucial, because we don't want to do anything that in fact brings a bigger gap between the income level in the country. We can't afford that, because we are going to pay a heavy price politically, socially, and otherwise. So I think it's something that we must address. And therefore, the more the scientific community can be involved more on the level of community type activities. How we do that is a challenge. Government must be involved, the private sector must be involved, the non-governmental communities, and the trade unions, they have to be involved. They cannot be left out of this exercise. Because if we're talking about empowering people, they must be involved in that. So I think it's an area that I honestly hope we can zero in on, because we were finding major challenge how to confront this problem. We had to send in teams into the community to see to it that the kids who were not involved in serious education activities during this pandemic, how do we get the parents involved and to make sure that they're monitoring their kids. And to some extent, as you know, you could have the PC and the question is what you're doing with it. And so, and a lot of time the kids are there on the PC and they're doing other things that are in fact harmful to their development. And therefore, unless the parents are involved, the community are involved, we could have a bigger gap growing on our watch. The other thing I wanted to mention as I have the floor, we have taken several times during the period of my service in government, initiatives to bring in the scientific community with their initiatives to look at specific things that can be done in agriculture. If fishing is a crucial area because that's for a number of our countries. The fishing is an important part of economic activity, foreign exchange and so on. And the science has to play a major role. How do we, the scientific institution, the universities, and not just the universities, because you have several research institutions in various countries that are doing some very innovative things. I found that out when I was going around the Caribbean looking at as the lead head for science and technology and going into countries and seeing such innovation. And I am not even sure the University of West Indies is aware of this. So I believe the University of West Indies is a critical factor. How can they be involved in the integration of that effort? So what's something that's been done in Jamaica in agriculture? Grenada is there fighting to find a solution and Jamaica has done it. How can we then use what the model established in Jamaica as an example to help the farmers in Grenada to optimize the success in the particular area? Similarly in fishing, similarly in tourism. These are the productive sectors. So I see the challenges, but I honestly believe it's not going to take a lot, but I think it's a commitment on our part to be able to find that unified approach towards building on the economic activity in the region as a whole. So I make the point, my sister, as you mentioned, financing. If we do not have the people, the government would be find it difficult in putting more money into something that the people, there is no buy-in from and no understanding, not enough understanding part of the population. So I suggest a lot more work we have to do together in that respect. And I think the University of West Indies is well placed. As you know, most of us, you look around the region, most of the leaders now, a former student at the University of West Indies, we could never forget where we come from. We could never forget what gave us the base of our education, the opportunities that we have today to reach the level we have reached. So I just want to underscore that important point. There are a couple issues I would wish to raise, but I would raise them as we go along with the rest of this program. And as I said before, this kind of forum is so important for us. But if we could have more of our people involved and listening to what is happening here, I think we'll gain a lot more from what we are trying to do. But I really believe the founding fathers of this exercise, I cannot compliment you more for this. This is such an important event.
And we agree with you. And your perspective, if I understand it, is saying that we have to have the funding approached from getting the support of the grassroots and the people, yes, and the community before it raises in the level of importance, yes, for folks to be introducing funding to support, yes, science and technology in that way. Do you agree, Professor Gyles? Do you think that has to happen from the ground up? Or do you think that going for private sector funding directly for science and technology is the way?
Before you go on, I just want to, I'm making the point only from the standpoint if the taxpayers are going to be asked to pay more, because there are several other ways in which you want to raise funds. And I know there are enormous amount of ways we can do so, but I'm talking from the standpoint of the government putting more directly into funding at that level. That's really the point I wanted to zero in on, right?
Understood.
Yes.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I fully agree with Dr. Mitchell on this particular point. And in fact, I even noted here that Dr. Honourable Ralph Gonsalves, Prime Minister of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, and outgoing chairman of the Conference of Heads of Government of Caricom, actually made a statement saying that solidifying the Caribbean community is really the best antidote for COVID-19. We have to work together to build, to work together to get the buy-in of all the stakeholders within the region to understand that this is an imperative for us. And the more we have the buy-in and the support, the more we will have the necessary funding support, both in terms of the willingness of taxpayers to see their tax dollars going towards supporting these kinds of initiatives. But not only that, but private sector who form a part of the society, they will also see the need.
Yes.
One of the very important things I believe also is the type of investment that is needed in building innovations and converting them to industries. We in the region, we are very innovative and we are very good at creating samples of very unique products that can do very well, but not many of them convert to scale, to become viable enterprises that can employ people and to have products that can be marketed to the rest of the world on a global scale. And this is one of the areas that I believe that we have to look at very seriously, because it's not that we are short of the ideas. We have the scientists and we have the innovators, even on the streets. One of the things that we have been trying to do at UTech Jamaica is to incubate small businesses, because we realize that one of the challenges that small businesses face is overcoming that initial formative stage of getting off the ground, because many businesses fail within the first 2 to 3 years of their existence. And so with the kind of support that can be given to help them to go beyond that formative stage, many of these businesses will be able to transition and become viable enterprises. We have a number of such examples that we have been able to incubate, and we put forward that type of initiative as one of the things that can be replicated across the region also, in terms of funding support and other forms of support that will help to provide the necessary funding base and the necessary infrastructural and other forms of support that are needed to drive the development of science and technology, to move it from the stage of just samples and to commercially viable enterprises.
Thank you for that, Professor Gyles. And I see perhaps echoes of something that Minister Green spoke to, with trying to get us to not just be consumers of technology, but creators of technology, and how
Indeed.
Perhaps we can be getting funds from that as an angle. I'd like to ask Professor Weber to weigh in on this. I know the Mona campus has had its research days effort for several years, showcasing things that has happened. Is this a viable source of funding for the region, sir?
Thank you very much. And yes, indeed, Paula and colleagues. So I want to start by thanking Prime Minister Mitchell for looking at how we need to get the grassroots involved. Because if you don't start there, once you talk about public funds, you need to get them involved. Otherwise, it's us and them. So very important. Professor Gyles as well, in terms of, so where do we go with it in terms of innovation? Well, you asked the question at the very beginning, Paul, funding. So there's pure research, and we need to fund that. Pure research begets focused, specialized research, which is something we need if we're going to look at particular problems. From that comes innovative research. So you have pure research, applied research, innovative research, and then commercialization of research. And only a small percentage gets to that point, but it needs to be funded. If you can show public and private sector what can be the outcome, then that sample that Colin just spoke of becomes a regular throughput. You can therefore fund publicly a part of it, but private sector should buy in. If you can answer a question raised by private sector, then they will be willing to fund that particular body of research. So it's important that the communication becomes open so that we at the universities do the research, not just because we want to do blue sky research, there is some of that in peer research, but the applied research, then the innovative research and the commercialization of that research becomes on the behalf, at the bequest of a private sector company who will pay for that and will continue to pay. And what more, they don't have to pay a university from Timbuktu or somewhere else. We are right here in the Caribbean. We know the situations and we're not going anywhere. So we will continue to provide those answers over time.
I like that you've brought it to us here in the Caribbean, and I want to toss it out, Professor Antoine, Professor Landis. How close are we as a region to working together in any way to provide that for the rest of the world? Or are we only doing it individually? Do you know?
Well, what I would like to say is that, and important for me to say to this audience, is that what we are dealing with are some very fundamental challenges, which are what I would consider to be economic, social, and cultural rights. We're not talking about luxuries. And that COVID has raised. So rights to water, right to education, right to health, right to work. And when I saw how inflexible our labor framework was and our scientific frameworks are and were they able to meet these very specific challenges? And indeed, Minister Floyd, I would say some of them were new, especially in the workplace. So it's not that everything is been there, done that. These specific concrete challenges, they do require these new innovative approaches, and they are priorities and should be priorities in terms of finance. We have to prioritize them because COVID exposed bare the very deep structural inequities that exist all throughout the region. And in my view, we must be able to devise these democratic, and I don't use that word lightly, innovative scientific technological solutions so that we can make these rights more accessible. So for example, education, like others, I was very troubled seeing children who weren't able to access the online and so on. And it wasn't just the primary school. 65 of my own law students, for example, I discovered in my horror, had no access, no laptop, no internet, etc. in a supposedly rich oil country. And we saw what has happened in SCA. Children have suffered in terms of the quality of their education, but we can now vacation on the moon. So why can't we use the science to create online access? This democratization of the science is what I'm talking about, to create genuine online learning environments, prioritizing that, using the funds we have throughout the Caricom. Access to water is another one, but let's only talk about the sanitizers. They were so expensive. The poor people can't really afford those fancy, and they went up in COVID. But just the basic right to water, and by extension, the right to health in the pandemic, which what could have been more important when, I don't know about other places, but in Trinidad and Tobago, many of our areas, rural areas, and low-income family areas, prisons and so on, have no water, no reliable water source, but you're supposed to wash your hands and sanitize and all of that. So again, it's a question of human rights, it's a question of structural inequities, and we have to have better solutions. Similarly, the poverty, the poor, the marginalized, these were the most at risk. It was not just the water and etc., but those who had to go out to work. Who was going out to work? It was the janitor, the cleaner, the bus driver. They were more at risk in terms of acquiring the COVID. But yes, the doctors too, I must admit, and the nurses. But by and large, underserved populations, the least equipped to handle a pandemic, poor diets, and I am so happy Prof. Weber talked about food security and so on. Poorer, worse immune systems, more vulnerable to illness. These are huge questions which I think concern science, but also concern the law, because we are talking of human rights, we are talking of social justice, and they intersect, we cannot divorce them. Who did we give the bailouts to? We gave it to the big fat entrepreneurs. We didn't give it to the poor people who really needed it. And when we did it, the informal sector was left out, for instance, so they weren't really prioritized. We had no flexibility in terms of our work environments. We didn't know what to do. So can you, just to give you one, I want to speak more about it later. I expected to do one presentation at a time, but let me just throw in this one. In terms of the workplace, for instance, nobody knew, and we still don't know, we haven't devised those solutions as yet, as to what happens in a pandemic. If you're at home for a year or more, who is liable? Can you get paid? Can you be laid off? Only 1 or 2 countries were courageous and changed laws, like St. Kitts, because the law was constructed a layoff after 104 days you terminated, but obviously you don't want to terminate people. So we had to devise these very different solutions because our labor law is not flexible enough. You can't use your vacation leave, for example, willy-nilly and tell people to quarantine. That would be a breach of contract. So you don't want to terminate people. So we have to provide these answers. What are the rights in terms of remote work? If you fall on your chair and you're typing, is it that, health and safety measures, do our laws accommodate pandemics and these emergency situations? No. And there are a whole host of them. And I was promised that this discussion is not only strictly science, because there's a social science as well, not just the science. So I want to blend that bit in there too, as to how we formulate these solutions as we move forward, having learned from the pandemic.
And I am happy that you're bringing up those perspectives. We can't go into a lot of detail because we really only have about 20 minutes left, but you have touched on several aspects that are common across the region. And I want to take it back. There are also things that I think were mentioned by Professor Landis when you mentioned in particular the secondary impacts of the pandemic that weren't taken into consideration as much as they should have been before. Professor Landis, do you see any solution in sight? We're identifying the issues. As a region, do you have any suggestions for a solution to all of this that requires financing?
Okay. I want to bring the conversation back based on you're asking for solutions. I think one thing that we learned from the pandemic is that we have to diversify our economies. It is extremely risky and dangerous if we have all of our eggs in the one basket, which is called tourism. And that is what leads to quite commonly in some of our Caribbean countries, which were very dependent on tourism, it wasn't uncommon to see a 20% drop of GDP. I mean, this is catastrophic. And so we have to diversify our economies. And I want to talk about the role that universities have in driving innovation, which has been spoken about a number of times. We know from the Caribbean Commission on the Economy that there is broad agreement that the innovation frameworks in the Caribbean are weak and that we need to work together on them. When we work together, we will need to have everyone at the table. So the innovation frameworks have to work for everyone. I heard Professor Gyles say that, there are people who are hawking goods on the street and they are innovators. They need to be at the table. They cannot just be forgotten as they were at the table when COVID came along. I mean, we were literally criminalizing people who needed to leave their work in order to put food on the table, saying you can't leave your home. I mean, that can't be right. So when we create these innovation systems, we need to establish that relationship between the higher education sector, the government, and the private sector. And as a good public university, we have to use the knowledge that we have to actually translate that knowledge into solutions for the public. We have to create value for Caribbean people. And so, good innovation that comes out of research, like Professor Weber spoke about, that is used to solve the problems of the Caribbean region. And so I do really endorse those comments that were made by other panelists to involve everyone from the ground up, so then people can see this university is working together with the government and the private sector to solve the problems that affect us.
Thank you, Professor Landis. Minister Green, you had mentioned that the research agenda appears to have become, my word, not yours, conservative, and that we should be pushing the boundaries some more. I would like to toss the question out about who sets the research agenda, and are we remaining individual as entities, governments, countries? Should there be perhaps a regional agenda, since so many of the issues that we face now in this post-COVID era are common?
Yeah, so I agree that there has to be a robust regional agenda, and clearly it's something that we have embarked on through our regional university, in terms of the regional university trying to drive that research agenda. I do believe that universities, academia have a very big role to play in pushing that research agenda and that research framework. Of course, government and policymakers and how they interact with the university, they have to, I agree with Professor Landis, they have to work in tandem to craft this agenda and to create a framework that the agenda can, come up through. And the agenda has to, it's been said time and time, I think Dr. Mitchell started us in the right direction. The agenda also has to come from the people. It is very critical that we are looking into the problems that the people have and not assuming the problems that they see as priorities and then solve those problems based on our assumptions without first asking the people what are their most critical challenges. And I think, Prof. Antoine has spoken about a number of them that, again, have been around, but yes, COVID-19 pointed a new light, a brighter light, and a different light, especially from a legal perspective. But challenges, for example, water. This is a regional challenge of still having communities that do not have access to potable water, right? Again, are we using science, technology, localized knowledge to develop solutions that can bring water into that community somewhere in Grenada, that the people will say, well, this is a result of science, research, the university working for us, and our government facilitating that. So I do believe it has to be a joined up approach in setting the agenda. I do strongly believe academia has a strong role to push the boundaries. I do believe we have become conservative, and it's right across our society. I'm not sure we think as big as we used to. I'm not sure we look for the bigger ideas and that we believe that we can solve the world's problems from right here in the Caribbean. And we have to create an ecosystem. And we've seen it that right here in Jamaica, it's right across the region. There is really a weak ecosystem for innovation. And we've tried to address it through a program that we're now running through the Development Bank of Jamaica called the Big E program, where we've put some funds, about 25 million United States dollars, to try and help create an ecosystem for innovation. But that has to be done on a regional level. Because again, as Dr. Mitchell said, Jamaica solving a problem just for Jamaica, it makes no sense when we have the same regional challenges. Additionally, when you look at the world, and one of the things that COVID has brought home to us is that we're so connected now, that solving a problem here in the Caribbean, we could be solving a problem in the world, right? So we do have to work on these frameworks, and we do have to work on the resources, and we have to get the buy-in so that government, public sector, and private sector can work together to create that framework.
Dr. Mitchell, thank you, Minister Green. Dr. Mitchell, from your position, you were with the Caricom Quasi Cabinet, responsibility for science and technology. How close are we to being one or working together in that way in terms of setting regional priorities? Because we have a lot of different ideas from the different campuses, a lot of different directions. Can we afford that? How close are we to putting all our efforts, or most of our efforts, behind those priorities?
I support strongly my brother Floyd Green there, and what he was saying about the more united approach. In fact, one of the problems the Caribbean has suffered with over the years has been the individualistic approach to a lot of the things that we do. Even if we're talking about investment in some scientific initiative, if we do this more at at a regional level. It will cost each of us less, and it will benefit each individual island much more. But there is that tendency that has hurt us in the region over the years. And while it is very much less than it used to be when I was growing up, I am telling you, at the level I was, I've seen it interfering in every aspect of our lives still. In cricket, in everything. I think if we bring that our services much more in a united way, we'll spend less, we'll gain a lot more. So that's one thing I certainly would hope that we can move. And I think the university may be in the best position because it's away from the partisan political interests, and it's seen it the big picture, because we at the political level sometimes we're too narrow-minded in the way we operate. So the university coming at another angle might be in the best position. That's why I'm really sounding off this afternoon for the university to play a stronger role. Particularly, as I mentioned, most of us at our base of education from this institution, we can't ignore it. And
if I may, Dr. Mitchell, are you saying that we are not there? How far are we? We're not there. We're not there
yet. We've come a long way.
Yeah,
you know the column, so we still have a long way to go.
And just to follow up, Paula, not to mention, we have as a region set priorities. Yes. I wouldn't say we've drilled them down, especially to research priorities, right? And that is part of the challenge. But additionally, is action. We've done a lot of papers. We've done a lot of, these are, as I said, we've identified some of our fundamental challenges across the region. But solution-oriented action to move us forward is where we've fallen short. That it's whether you talk about legislation and bringing our legislation together and upgrading our legislation, as we do that in a very piecemeal fashion. We oftentimes look outside before we look inside. So we have to do more.
How do we do more?
Can I throw in one suggestion? So I chair the Environmental Foundation of Jamaica, which is a body which has gotten funds, and we can talk about how the funds came. But using a call process, individuals, entities, public sector, private sector, NGOs, universities apply for funding to do research that you have now focused and given direction to. Isn't it time for us to have a Caribbean research fund, for Caricom to have a Caribbean research fund, which can be competed for by NGOs, universities, entities, but the call would be driven by that entity to say, we are going to do, whether it is climate change or food security or legal implications of being away from work and study areas. You can set an agenda for 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, and a pool of funds to which people apply. You then have focus, you've garnered funds, and you focus those funds in a particular area for a particular way. Again, something that works in Jamaica, why not make it Caribbean-wide?
My friend, my sister, the professor just raised that point. But the question is, where the initiative will come from? Where is the initiative coming from? I think the university is well placed to take that initiative and give a succinct proposal as to how they should be done. Let me give you an example. I had a bachelor degree at one university, UWI, master's in one, another one, a PhD in another one. Over the years, I have got constant letters from the last two institutions that I studied at, asking for support for several initiatives, in fact, scientific initiative and other initiative. I have never got a letter from UWI for funding for any simple thing. You have students from all over the world that you have taught that you've made what they are today. And they have a responsibility. I have one, but I don't get anything from, I mean, I don't have a lot, but the little I have, I should be able to give something. And I honestly believe we have to start doing a lot more for ourselves, our institution. I believe the university is the best place to initiate this. And I will certainly do whatever I can in my own capacity, more time on my hand now to help in that particular, because I see a tremendous void. I have mentioned this at the level of heads to the university, at the highest level of the university. And it's indicated that initiative will be taken. I hope and pray to see a lot more initiative. The university touching base with its past students and ensuring that, because we have connection. Your students have connection, not just their own resources, the little they may have, but they have connection at a wider level in wherever they are, whether it's in West Indies or abroad. They have enormous amount of connections that we should be able to use.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mitchell. Good opportunity there. Professor Antoine, you had something you were saying on the heels of Professor Weber's comments?
Oh, well, I want to say that I am taking my former students' concerns seriously, Minister Floyd Green, that yes, this thing about conservative, it took me a minute to understand what he's saying, and I think I agree with him. So although we are doing research, and I'm speaking as a principal here and a researcher, and this session is supposed to be looking at science in all its forms, social science included, in terms of research agendas and solutions for the future, I think perhaps we do need to look at COVID and identify the specific concrete gaps, and I've identified some of them here today, and try to now think bigger. We can solve the problems of the region, the world. I'm reminded that in India, there's a Nobel Prize winner. What he was able to do, he was able to do something with the gene, and Prof. Weber, you know the specifics, I don't know the specifics, and to make the food more potent and be able to feed millions of people in India. Something that simple little act helped to prevent starvation in India and the world. So if we're talking about education, as I mentioned, and internet, we know about digitization. That is where our research should be, to make it cheaper, more accessible. If we're talking about right health, we're talking about the diet, the kind of food enhancement and food security, not just getting the food, but the quality of food, etc., etc. The water, we know. I think our research could be more targeted and to be more developmental. We need to develop the region. I think that's a fair comment.
Thank you for that. And coming out of that and out of the other comments, there is a question in the chat that I'd like to throw, coming from Daniel Kaur. And it says, to the extent that organizations were able to use virtual meeting software, other electronic tools to operate while under lockdown, COVID-19 has opened our eyes to the different ways to operate. How does each of our panelists, all leaders in your own right, intend to support initiatives that seek to take advantage of this opportunity to encourage technology development in the Caribbean? And before you answer, we are really in the closing part. So I'd like to pull that question and reframe it a little bit. How are you, in your own right, going to be working with your country to help us develop as a region to be powered by science and technology? I have to ask that your closing comments be restricted to about 2 to 3 minutes as we move to the close of our discussion. And let's see, Minister Green, would you like to go first?
Okay, no problem. Thank you. And I'm happy as always, these things are much too short, but I really believe we should have a follow-up, and I'm putting it out there. I really think we should. We are definitely continuing on our digital transformation journey. Whereas in the Office of the Prime Minister, I've been tasked with leading that digital transformation journey. So we're not just taking the learnings from COVID and leaving that. We're moving forward. We've recognized that access is a big issue. We rolled out an emergency broadband network. We're looking to do a national broadband network to try and bring fiber and high-speed internet to more places in Jamaica at a cost that is sustainable, because one of the big challenges we have across the region is costing in terms of access to high-speed internet. And also, more importantly, I think what I don't want us to do is to go back to our old manual way of doing things and get back into that rut. So how can we transform our processes in government to make it easier for people to interact? We're leading that charge, and as a region, I believe it's something that we have to embark on. I support Professor Weber's call. We should have a Caribbean Research Fund, and it is something that I think all heads should see how we could achieve. But I agree with Dr. Mitchell that the university has to take a leading role. But my final point, I made it again, how can we ensure that we're thinking big in our research? How can we ensure that we're really looking at developmental issues and are solving world problems, right? These are problems that we have the capacity to solve, but we have to ensure that there's a framework that brings forward that thought leadership so that it can be done. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister Green, and thank you for keeping it concise. We're going to go to Dr. Mitchell. How can we support those initiatives to encourage technology development?
I'll speak to one aspect of it, the question of finance. I think we've seen in the OECS, where we have the OECS Health Organization that import medicines on bulk. And what we've realized is by doing so, whether under special organized institution, we have been able to buy much more for individual countries because it be getting cheaper. Now, what's wrong with the Ministry of Education in each country getting an idea of the total amount of equipment necessary for the use of the technology, to use the platform to get to children as far as the education is concerned? If we do that and we're buying bulk, some of us would have had a number of initiatives already, but there must be still a lot more countries and a lot more people that we have not reached. Why can't we then do something in a bulk area, which of course will reduce the whole question of the cost? And in the so doing, we can, the stakeholder, the persons who make this equipment, we could also use them to make a contribution in terms of the knowledge of information necessary to bring optimum value to reaching our people at all levels in the society. That would be my contribution. And as far as that particular, but before you leave, I just wonder if you get big, no, you could go ahead, but I just want 1 minute before you close to make a specific point that I wanted to make.
Go ahead, sir. These are the closing remarks.
Well, the
We can
last
give you
point I
60
wanted to
seconds
make,
more.
I'm suggesting that if we could have this sort of meeting yearly and have it in individual countries. Hopefully we have no virus that we have to do it in virtual, and involve the people and the audience to be part of that process, where we are speaking to them. You have the political directorate, you have the private sector, you have the academic, and you have to lead it. I'm saying that your leadership is crucial. And I believe by coming in the individual countries and involving at different levels, you will find that people become a lot more understanding of the problems they face and how the science can help them in their daily lives.
Thank you so much. Professor Gyles, your comments, sir.
Thank you so much. I want to point to the fact that ICT is where the world is going. While we as small developing economies have many challenges manufacturing to scale, and not being able to compete with larger economies such as China and others because of labor market challenges and the scale of manufacturing production, I point to intellectual property in software development and ICT areas as very open to us. I remind myself that Steve Jobs started Apple in his parents' garage, and within a short while, it grew tremendously. And just imagine the impact of an Apple in the region, a Microsoft in the region, the scope and extent of the economic impact that it can have. And I'm saying that we have the local capacity and we have to target areas where we are strong and can compete. And I believe that ICT development, software development is one area in which we can have an impact on the world on a scale that can put us forward economically. And so I strongly support the initiative that Minister Green has mentioned a while ago, making internet access available to every nook and cranny of the country and within the region. I believe this type of initiative is something that can make a tremendous difference to enhancing the intellectual capacity of our people, and also the capacity to support the development of small businesses to transform ideas from samples and products to viable commercial enterprises. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that, Professor Gyles. And you mentioned intellectual property, the legal aspect and angle, always important as we move through. Professor Antoine?
Yes, well, some excellent points already made. Well, as I said earlier, I am committed to multidisciplinary approaches, and my target is concrete developmental types of objectives too, and this whole idea of democratizing access to what are really economic rights. But apart from the Caricom emphasis, which of course I agree with, I would mention the multi-campus, because we of course have several campuses. So the campuses working together, I'm committed to that as well. And just to mention, St. Augustine, some of you may not know, has the only faculty of agriculture in the UE. And so that is real for us as principal. And we have started to look at issues like food security. We used to be very focused on those things before and enhancing food. For example, we've invented things like new types of pest-resistant yams, etc. So all things to do with food and nutrition, which of course will improve person's health. And renewable energies, I think, is something that in Trinidad and Tobago that you were interested in the country. We're an oil country, but development has been uneven. So there's diversification that Clive spoke about, and also other renewable energies are indeed more accessible to others. And clearly, I agree with what everybody has said about internet and digitization. This is already a UE-wide initiative, which we clearly support. And for me personally, I'm part of the National Task Force for Labor Law, as you heard. So we're looking at legal infrastructure as well. So that's it.
Thank you for the Trinidad perspective. Let's move across to Cave Hill. Professor Landis?
Yes, I fully agree with what was said before by Minister Green and by Professor Gyles. We have the creativity in the Caribbean, and we need to combine our creativity and our intellectual property with the medium of digital transformation so that we can overcome the traditional limitations of size and scale and reach markets in the world. We have the creativity and the innovation, but we have to also admit that our innovation frameworks are relatively weak. And so we have to concentrate as a region to strengthen those frameworks so that there can be investment funds that would help young inventors get through some of the stages of the invention process, because usually the ideation phase is there and it's in the market access, the mediation phase, and certainly the commercialization phase where we just unfortunately tail off. So those would be my approaches, and UE is fully invested in being a part of this.
Thank you, Professor Landis. And finally, Professor Weber.
But I don't think I can add much more to all that has been said, because we've encapsulated digital transformation with financing and new ideas in terms of allowing those to get their creativity in place. I think what we need to do as individual organizations or collectively is to create the platform, create the awareness, create the opportunities, and then continue to promote them. I think Daniel is right in that we should be using what we've learned from the last 2 years of COVID to change how we approach some of the things that we would normally do. And I think we've all embraced that. I mean, talking to Colin, he and I talk all the while about what UTech and UWI Mona can do, but I also talk to my colleagues at the other campuses, and I think we are all on the same page where we recognize we have the vehicle to make the change. We need a little more funding to make it happen, but we have the creativity and the capacity so to do.
Yes.
Thank you, Professor Weber. Ladies and gentlemen, time does not permit an extended close, but I must say that I believe I can echo the sentiments that the important areas have been ventilated, have been explored. We've looked at elements that are all being considered for this conference, science and technology as a driver of transformation, driver development, resilience, innovation, vision, entrepreneurship, and coming out of this, perhaps a renewal of efforts, more focused efforts, as we work together to chart the way forward in this post-COVID era. Thank you very much for your participation. I'm Paula-Ann Porter-Jones. It was my pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you.